Dueling with pistols was a grave and solemn procedure. There was an umpire.
Gentlemen, are you ready?
And each of the protagonists had a second to assist and witness.
Gentlemen, present.
Conducted in secret, these illegal encounters were carried out with great formality and according to strict codes.
On my signal.
For centuries, duels have been fought with the sword. In a ritual that invoked ancestral links to class and privilege, the sword reigned supreme, long after the pistol was invented. However, by the mid-18th century, there had been a shift towards duelling with pistols. A steady arm, a keen eye, and an icy composure now became the guardians of a gentleman's honour. In this film, I investigate the dedicated dueling pistol, with its stylish elegance, deadly and designed for purpose. I examine both flintlock and percussion lock mechanisms, and I test the lethal sensitivity of a hair trigger. There it goes. In 1826, David Landale fought the last fatal duel in Scotland. His descendant, the BBC's James Landale, recounts the story.
The bullet sort of went in through his ribs, through the centre of his torso, and then came out the back.
I explore the story of the famous duel between Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. I also visit a pub in Camden Town, which played a significant role in the demise of duelling in Britain. This is the story of how the pistol came to replace the sword as the weapon of choice for settling disputes of honour. Dueling with pistols did not become standard practice until around 1760, even though the pistol had been invented 2 centuries earlier. Pistols, guns small enough to be held and shot with one hand, first appeared in the 16th century. Horsemen needed a gun that could be used with one hand, and by the 17th century the pistol had become a standard cavalry weapon. Even so, for dueling, the sword continued to be thought of as the more honourable weapon, the only true gentleman's weapon. But that was all to change. By the mid-18th century, flintlock pistols like this had become a primary weapon for the officer class, both on land and at sea. Pistols were now the weapons with which honour and glory were won on the battlefield, and romantic notions in favour of the sword had begun to fade. Pistol was also considered a great equaliser, favouring marksmanship and chance over agility and brawn. All that was required was a good aim, bucket of luck, and a dollop of sang-froid. Pistols and duelling with pistols became all the rage, and a young man making his way in society had great standing if it became known that he had blazed. A new era for the duel had begun, and with it emerged a new kind of pistol, specially designed for dueling. Seeking to create a new market for their wares, English gunsmiths first developed purpose-made dueling pistols around 1770. Dueling pistols were the ultimate in refinement, elegance, and precision. Longer barrels not only made them look sleek, but also improved accuracy. The distinctively thick octagonal barrel was heavier, and this reduced muzzle flip, helping to keep a steady aim. In 1804, Aaron Burr, Vice President of the United States, issued a challenge to Alexander Hamilton.
Hamilton was a former First Secretary of the Treasury and also a founding father. The two men had long been rivals, but disparaging remarks made by Hamilton at a dinner party, followed by inflammatory correspondence, resulted in Burr issuing the challenge to duel.
A challenge that Hamilton accepted despite his strong opposition to the custom of dueling. His 19-year-old son Philip had been tragically killed in a duel just 3 years earlier.
The pistols used in young Philip Hamilton's duel had been borrowed from his uncle, John Barker Church, and Alexander Hamilton borrowed the same set of pistols for his duel with Aaron Burr. His second gave one to Burr and loaded the other for Hamilton. Those pistols, with light hair triggers, are now in the collections of the J.P. Morgan Chase Bank. The Hamilton-Burr duel took place at Weehawken, New Jersey. On the cliffs overlooking the Hudson River, there is a site where 18 duels have been recorded, including that of Hamilton's son. It is also where Burr and Hamilton met.
Accompanied by their seconds, the two men arrived early in the morning on July the 11th, 1804. Hamilton had told friends that he intended to delope, that is, to deliberately fire wide. However, we cannot be certain exactly what happened. Accounts vary from witnesses. Maybe Hamilton deloped, but some say that Burr shot first, and it was as Burr's ball struck Hamilton that it caused Hamilton's pistol to fire. Others say that it was Hamilton's hair trigger, and that it was as Hamilton was lowering his arm to aim, his hair trigger went off by accident.
Whatever happened, it was Hamilton who was fatally wounded. He died 31 hours later. Burr fled, his political career in ruins. In a tragic irony, both Alexander Hamilton and his son Philip had been killed by the very same pistols. A hair trigger, also known as a set trigger, was a common feature on many dueling pistols. It reduced the drag on the trigger pull. A more sensitive trigger meant less risk of a jerky action.
Alexander Hamilton was a soldier. He fought with Washington in the Revolutionary War. So how likely is it that he would be caught out by a hair trigger? What I want to find out is just how sensitive are hair triggers. So we've got this rig set up. At the moment, the trigger is on a normal standard setting. So I've already poured some lead into here, and I'm just going to spoon a little bit more, and we'll try and find out what sets it off. No, not going yet. Even more. There it goes. So, what did it take for that standard trigger to go off? I think it's at least going to be 4 pounds. So I'm going to start putting a 4-pound weight on to counterbalance. Yep, that's not even doing it. So I'd put another pound on. 5 pounds. 5.5. It's just nearly coming in. No, not quite. 5.5. And a bit. You're just a fraction over 5.5 pounds for that trigger. So let me just let that drop down, take these weights off, and now we'll see what a set trigger does. So I'll remove this heavy weight. Let's get the set trigger going first. So I'll move that forward. All you do to set a trigger is you push the trigger forward. There's a little click there. That's now on a set trigger setting. Take that to half cock, put a little bit of powder in so we can see when it goes off. Close the pan, take it to full clock. Now, let's put this on. And that's just taken the strain, and now we will start pouring in. Oh, it's going to take a bit more. It's nothing compared to the standard one, however. There it is. There it is. So what did it take for that set trigger, that hair trigger to go off? I'm going to use these weights. I'm going to start with just 8 ounces, half a pound, and then put another 4 ounces, so that's 12 ounces, not yet. Another 2, 14 ounces, 15 ounces, oh, that's coming about level, isn't it, at 15 ounces? So just shy of a pound. If I put another ounce on, yeah, definitely a pound. So just shy of a pound for the hair trigger and 5.5 pounds for the standard trigger. So a hair trigger really is an incredibly sensitive mechanism.
Hamilton and Burr were not the only politicians to be drawn into a duel. US President Andrew Jackson is thought to have been involved in as many as 100 duels. He is widely regarded as a hothead. France's Prime Minister during the First World War, Georges Clemenceau, fought at least a dozen duels in his earlier life. Among British Prime Ministers there was William Pitt the Younger, who fought a duel on Putney Heath with George Tierney in 1798. Neither man was injured. Most famously, the Duke of Wellington, as Prime Minister, fought a duel with Lord Winchelsea. It took place on Battersea Fields in 1829. It is easy for us to scoff at the foolishness of the custom, but many otherwise intelligent and measured men yielded to the social pressure to duel. That must tell us something of its hold. There were various ways in which a duel could be conducted. It was the business of the seconds to agree the exact rules and then, with the assistance of an umpire, to enforce them. The word rifling describes spiral grooves inside a barrel, which give it a considerable advantage by improving accuracy.
The standard protocol was to duel with a smoothbore pistol. Now, most pistols were smoothbore, but some pistols had what was called secret rifling, scratch rifling. It's very faint, you can't see it with the naked eye, and if your opponent's second tested your gun, he would try and feel with his finger, feel nothing. It would feel smoothbore because it only came up to here. But with the aid of a modern light inside, I can see the spirals of the rifling. And what the rifling does is it imparts spin to the ball. And a spinning projectile is more stable because there are less oscillations and it is therefore more powerful and more accurate.
Although duelists could start back-to-back, then walk away an agreed number of paces before turning to fire at will, this was rarer in real life than it is in drama. More usual was a measured distance. This was paced out by the seconds under the supervision of the umpire. 12 paces was typical, but distances ranged from anything between 10 and 20 paces. Once in position, the principals had to wait to fire on a signal from the umpire.
Present. Give fire.
On occasion, duelists were given a minute, during which they could discharge up to 3 shots. At other times, lots were drawn to establish who had the right of first fire. If he missed, the duelist who had fired first was obliged to stand his ground and receive his adversary's return fire.
There are 2 basic stances taken by pistol duelists. The first is with a fully outstretched arm, much better for aiming. Disadvantage is that it exposes this side and a ball can drive through the lungs and heart. What many duelists did was they shot with a crooked arm like this, so that the bones of the arm are protecting these vital organs. In all cases, duelists were advised to stand sideways, making a smaller target, he says, sucking in, and I'm reminded of the words of Charles James Fox.
Fox was a famously rotund Whig politician who fought a duel with his fellow MP William Adam in 1779.
His second advised him to stand sideways, and Fox retorted, "Why? I'm as wide one way as I am the other." And he opted to stand face on. He was struck in the chest, but only wounded lightly, and survived the encounter.
Dueling was a calculated risk. Many survived duels either unharmed or only lightly scathed. Some duelists, fearful of a murder prosecution, had their seconds put only a small charge of powder in the barrel. The intention was to inflict only a light wound. In 1833, one surgeon lamented that the quantity of powder is so small that it will not send a ball through a moderately thick gentleman. It therefore sticks in some place, to the extreme disadvantage of the patient and to the great annoyance of the surgeon. Aside from being killed, a gentleman had to weigh the risk of being branded a coward against the risk of a charge of murder. In his book Duel, the BBC's Diplomatic Correspondent, James Landale, describes in great detail a duel which was fought in 1826 by his ancestor David Landale and his bank manager George Morgan. I went to meet James to hear his account of this extraordinary piece of family history. A tale which gives him a compelling connection to a real-life duel.
David Landale was a very respectable merchant. He bought and traded linen. He was involved in the tanning industry. He was chairman of the local chamber of commerce. So he was a very respectable individual. So he was not the person you would imagine would naturally be drawn to dueling.
And who was George Morgan?
George Morgan was a very different man to David Landale. He was a banker and therefore supposed to be a sort of respectable member of the community.
There are no surviving portraits of George Morgan, but to help tell the story, we've created this imagined portrait of him.
He was a much more fiery character. There's lots of evidence that he was involved in insulting people and disputes and rows, and he'd threatened people with dueling before. He was also a former soldier. He had gone through all those battles against Napoleon's armies in Spain.
In the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, Scotland's economy was struggling, and so too was David's business. This led him to apply for a bank loan with Morgan, an application that was turned down.
After that, George Morgan started spreading rumours within the town about David Landale's creditworthiness. And so instantly, all his other creditors started saying, "Oh, can we have our money back too?" So David Landale wrote a stiff letter to the Bank of Scotland in Edinburgh saying, "Look, what is your banker doing? He's damaging my reputation and my creditworthiness." This letter was then sent to George Morgan and his brother, and they were, George was furious about this. So he wanted to resolve this by a duel, and he did everything he possibly could to provoke David Landale into challenging him. He failed, so eventually he just decided, George Morgan, walking down the Kirkcaldy High Street one day, that he would whack David Landale over the shoulders with his umbrella. And at that point, one gentleman had insulted another. David Landale felt he had no alternative at that point but to issue a challenge to George Morgan.
The challenge is accepted, and so David Landale takes the ferry south towards Edinburgh, where he buys a pair of pistols from a gun shop. Pistols that are still preserved in the Kirkcaldy Museum.
And the man who sells them pistols says, "Oh yes, you can depend on those pistols because they're the ones that killed the man up at Queensferry last year." In other words, these pistols had been used in a duel already and they'd killed a man.
A particular feature of Landale's new pistols is that they were percussion locks. The percussion lock was a new state-of-the-art firing mechanism. It was a considerable improvement on the older flintlocks.
Flintlocks worked by this piece of flint striking this piece of steel and creating a spark, and that spark sets light to this powder, and that spark goes through a little hole there into the main charge, and it goes bang. They were really quite reliable, except in wet and windy conditions. and ignition was also relatively slow.
In the early 1800s, a Scottish minister, the Reverend Alexander Forsyth, who was also an inventor, began experiments in his garden shed to find a system that was both instantaneous and weatherproof.
What he came up with was this, the percussion lock pistol. And it works on the principle of fulminate of mercury, a chemical compound which produces a spark just by percussion.
Produced by dissolving mercury in nitric acid and mixing with ethanol, it is extremely sensitive to shock.
The challenge was how to contain the explosive in an easily usable form. And he and other inventors over the next couple of decades experimented with various things, coming up with this little copper percussion cap. It's a little bit fiddly, but it fits into the gun like so. And for the first time, detonation was reliable, dependable, and that was very reassuring for the duelist.
A little before sunrise on August the 25th, 1826, accompanied by their seconds and by their doctors, David Landale and George Morgan each made their way to a field on the outskirts of Kirkcaldy. A map drawn by an eyewitness tells us the story in detail.
We've got a map here which was produced at the trial. This is drawn by one of the witnesses.
Yeah, this is a map that was created for the trial so that everybody could know what happened, where it happened, how far out of town it was, who was standing where. So in other words, a classic dueling location. It's out of town, shielded by woods, it's not overseen by anything, so there will be no witnesses, and they can do it secretly early in the morning.
We see the duelists here, 8 and 9. Which is which?
I think that 8 is Landale and 9 is Morgan.
Landale, now the owner of a pair of percussion lock pistols, offered one to Morgan. However, being a traditionalist, Morgan declined.
Morgan used flintlocks because he was a former soldier. This was technology that was tried and tested for him, utterly reliable. He would be very, very familiar with it. But the thing you've got to understand here is that you have two men facing each other. One is an experienced gunman. He's a soldier. He has fired his weapon hundreds of times. And yet David Landale, complete novice. There's no evidence that he's ever pulled a trigger in his life. He's using pistols that he bought the day before for the first time, whereas there is evidence that Morgan, the night before, practiced.
Court records show that Morgan had spent the night practicing by shooting at an old door. Combined with his military experience, it would seem that he had the upper hand.
George Morgan raised his gun too early and had to be told by the seconds, the umpires if you like, no, Mr. Morgan, lower your pistol until you're all ready.
So the order comes to fire, and
they do fire at the same time. There's a single retort, and all the witnesses say that there was this look of utter disbelief over George Morgan's face as he realised he'd been hit. The bullet sort of went in through his ribs, through the centre of his torso, and then came out the back of his shoulder, and he slumped. And by all accounts, he died almost instantly. Essentially, Morgan missed, Landale hit, I think more out of luck than anything else. He would say it was fortune, God, because this is the whole point about duels, is that many people believe that God decided the outcome. And certainly David believed that Providence had guided his ball.
With Morgan dead, Landale now faced a new challenge: the court.
He was always willing to face trial, but what he didn't want to do was to be detained in the meantime before the trial.
David already had a plan in place, escaping to a hideaway in the Lake District. He had a false name so he could stay in touch with his business and his friends.
And he also said to his friends, look, tell the judges and the authorities, the sheriff's men, I will turn up for the trial when it happens.
And turn up he did. The trial was held at the Sheriff's Court in Perth.
Perth Court is packed. You know, this is a really big story. Everybody is there. They want to see what happens. David's a bit nervous. He's written to his friends saying, look, can you send me some really thick socks? Because I fear having cold feet in the dock. It's a court that's pretty brutal. A lot of people are sent for transportation to Australia. People are sentenced to hang for theft and things like that. So, you know, this judge is no slouch. And everybody knew the murder had taken place. So that wasn't in any way disputed. But what his lawyer's tactic was to say, look, there was no malice in this. So he tried to show that David had taken huge steps to avoid this duel.
The sensational story travelled right across the world. As reported by Australia's Sydney Gazette and New South Wales Advertiser, Landale's lawyer, Henry Coburn, made the following defence. The defendant admits generally that he had a quarrel with Mr. George Morgan, the result of which he sincerely laments. But Mr. Morgan brought that quarrel and all its consequences upon himself by striking his adversary on the public street.
He had only issued a challenge when he'd been physically hit, and he'd constantly said, I will accept a full apology from Morgan, and there doesn't need to be a duel. But Morgan had resisted that, repeatedly saying, no apology, no apology. The judge in question made it very clear that his view was that Landale had behaved appropriately. But the people he had to persuade were a jury, 15 men, and interestingly, they were mainly middle-class people. They were traders and farmers, not aristocracy, but not the lower sections of society. But they were not people who duelled themselves. That was considered for their aristocratic betters to do it. And what was really interesting was they didn't take very long to decide his fate. They came out and declared him not guilty, with character unsullied. What completely grips me about this story is the dilemma that David had. He had to do something really difficult. He had to decide not just to do something dangerous and risk his own life, but also whether this was the right thing to do. It's an incredibly courageous thing to do, to stand up, to take somebody else's fire. And I thought, would I do that? Would I have that courage that he had to stand up, not just for his name, but also just to show whether you can do it or not? In the end, he decided that he had a sense of duty, not just to himself, but also to his community. Because George Morgan's behaviour was not just, bad in itself, it actually threatened, the economy of the town, because if David Landale's business went down, that would have an impact on other people. So David was not just standing at that lonely field to defend his own honour, he was also doing it to stand up, I think, probably for his communities as well.
As duelling with pistols became more common, shooting galleries were established in towns and cities. The usual targets were small pieces of card, the size of playing cards, known as wafers. Gentlemen practiced their shooting not only to be ready for a duel, but also to deter one. Lord Byron, for instance, practiced daily and was known as a crack shot. It would be a foolhardy person who challenged him. As the 19th century progressed towards its halfway point, and the world raced to industrialise and be modern, distancing itself from the traditions of the past, duelling began to fall out of fashion. Except, that is, for military men. For an officer, honour was his stock in trade and courage was his currency. And although controversial, duelling remained rampant among the military classes. However, I'm on my way to the spot in North London where a duel between two soldiers triggered a lasting change.
Back in the 19th century, this used to be called the Camden Arms. It was renamed the Colonel Fawcett in memory of Lieutenant Colonel David Fawcett, who died here whilst being tended for an injury that he received in a duel.
Lieutenant Colonel Fawcett and Colonel Alexander Munro fought a duel nearby on July the 1st, 1843. They had married sisters and so were each doubly brothers-in-law. They had fallen out because Fawcett accused Munro of mishandling his affairs while he was away on service in China. The duel took place in nearby fields, but its consequences played out here.
Wounded and bleeding profusely, Fawcett was carried away on a door and brought here to this tavern. The ball had entered his right side through his lung and descended down to his intestines. The wound was fatal. According to one report, a constable had heard just a single shot. When questioned, Fawcett said to him, "What is it to you?" It was an accident. Doctors attended Fawcett here for 2 days. He died cradled in the arms of his wife.
Munro fled to Belgium, but later stood trial for murder. He was found guilty, but was treated with leniency, serving only 1 year in prison. This is believed to be the last fatal duel in England. Appalled by the story and swayed by public sentiment, Queen Victoria decided that it was time something was done about what she described as the barbarous practice of dueling. The Articles of War, Army regulations, were changed so that not only the participants in a duel, but also anyone who knew of it and did not take steps to stop it, would be court-martialed and cashiered, that is, drummed out of the army. The government also brought in a new law denying a pension to the widow of a dueling officer.
By considering duty to one's family as a greater act of honour than duty to one's personal reputation, those challenged to a duel could now turn the other cheek. This now became the nobler course of action, and where the military led in matters of honour, the civilian population followed. Now, social customs seldom disappear overnight, they fade over time. But in Britain, at least, I think it can be said that the end of duelling began with the tragic death of Lieutenant Colonel Fawcett in July 1843.
It took a little longer to decline elsewhere in Europe and in the United States, but it faded nonetheless. The Western shootout may sometimes be thought of as a distant cousin to the European duel of honour, but it was neither subjected to the same rules and formalities, nor provoked by the same codes of conduct. It had more to do with rough justice, self-defence and retribution.
Dueling was an extremely serious business. Many thousands of men staked their lives to defend their honour over the centuries. And if we're to understand the times in which they lived, then we need to try to understand the incredibly powerful social forces that drove them to such extreme measures. They were no different to us. They simply lived in a different world.
Gentlemen, present.
Thanks for watching this video on the History Hit YouTube channel. You can subscribe right here to make sure you don't miss any of our great films that are coming out. Or if you are a true history fan, check out our special dedicated history channel, historyhit.tv. You're going to love it.